What happens when you're so desperate to contend immediately, yet all signs and all logic point to the fact that you're not? You get the Seattle Kraken, and you end up in no man's land. This is Seattle, the NHL's no man's land. Now, the Seattle Kraken have been in the NHL since the 2021-2022 NHL season. They have made the playoffs once in that time period, but for the majority of it, they have been in what I like to call no man's land. Not good enough to contend for the playoffs, but not bad enough to seriously have a chance at winning the draft lottery and snag a generational franchise-changing prospect. But for the full details on how we got here, our story does not start in Seattle in 2021. No, our story starts in Vegas in 2017. I promise this is relevant. So, the Vegas Golden Knights came into the NHL in the 2017-2018 season. This was the first time the NHL had expanded in almost 2 decades, and people were hyped about it. People were hyped for it. Younger fans who either weren't alive or were too young to remember the other expansion teams coming in were excited because they got to see something fresh, something new. And even the fans that had been around for the previous expansion got excited too, because 2 decades is a long time. But you know what? 2 decades is a long time to forget what expansion teams usually are, because historically, expansion teams were putrid. Instantly bad, instantly bottom dwellers, and they stayed there for a pretty substantial amount of time. Before anyone brings up the first expansion, that was completely different because every one of the 6 expansion teams were their own conference, guaranteeing an expansion team would be in the Stanley Cup Finals, to which they were promptly swatted down by whatever original 6 team was in the finals against them. But Vegas bucked that trend. Vegas benefited from having much favorable expansion rules compared to what they usually were. And GMs were very concerned about losing certain players. So they would cut deals with the Vegas Golden Knights, mortgaging picks, prospects, etc., to ensure certain players were not taken. And then Vegas took those picks, took those prospects, in some cases, developed them, but in most cases, flipped them for NHL-ready players, and Vegas has been a runaway freight train ever since. And again, I cannot stress enough how unheard of, how once in a lifetime this event was, because, as I said, no other expansion team had come in and hit the ground running like the Vegas Golden Knights did. And that is why Seattle is the way that they are. Because when Seattle came in 2021, Vegas had the expectations set unfairly, because that was lightning in a bottle that was never going to happen again. Because in the interim period, the other GMs were not quite happy with how everything worked out with Vegas and the first expansion. So they made it a point that they were not going to make those same deals with Seattle that they had made with the Golden Knights. And sure enough, they stuck to it. They didn't. So Seattle came in with the weight of ownership and fans on their shoulders, because all the fans thought Vegas could be replicated. And this is one of the things that I've always asked and I've always thought to myself when GMs go out and take some pretty ill-advised big swings to contend when they're not close. Is it really the GM who thinks this is a good idea? Or is it ownership putting the pressure on them? And in Seattle, I firmly believe it was ownership putting the pressure on to replicate the Golden Knights formula. Now, I'm not saying Ron Francis was a perfect GM, far from it, but I think ownership has a lot to play here. So now let's dive in to Seattle and what got them into no man's land here. Now, the expansion draft, they were very heavily criticized for playing everything safe. The big example of where they zigged where they should have zagged was they took Curtis McDermott when they could have had Vladimir Tarasenko. Now, at the time, you can kind of justify it. Tarasenko was having some injury problems, and he was on a very expensive contract. But as we have seen in the years since, Tarasenko has been able to bounce back and become a very effective NHL player again. Something Seattle could have needed a spark of offense in their lineup right away. So that was the big hiccup on the expansion draft. I know a lot of people at the time criticized them for not taking Carey Price, but I think history has proven that was the right call. Carey Price played 5 NHL games, I think, at most after that. But where Seattle really, really has fallen short is in 2 areas: free agency and prospect development. Let's take a look at free agency first. And the one that everyone's thinking of is the contract they signed Philip Grubauer to, 6 years for $5.9 million. Now, at the time, this looked like a pretty good signing. Philip Grubauer was coming off a very, very, very successful run with the Colorado Avalanche, where he was actually nominated for the Vezina Trophy the year before. But again, this is what I say about knowing where you are and having self-awareness. The Colorado Avalanche was, are, and will be for the foreseeable future a better team than the Seattle Kraken. Much better defense, much better forwards, much better systems. It just lends itself better to being a more successful goaltender in that system. And we knew that there would probably be a dip in his numbers from what they were to Colorado. But nobody saw the drop-off we had coming. 889, 895, 899, 875, and a 909 save percentage. That is putrid. That is awful. The year with the 875, he actually got himself sent down to the AHL. And it has just been an absolute disaster of a contract. He was never able to replicate the formula he had in Colorado. They thought he was going to be the piece to put them over the top in their first year and help them go on a run, and it just didn't happen. What happened in Colorado, you may ask? Oh, they went on to win the Stanley Cup the next year with Darcy Kemper, kind of solidifying that it didn't really matter if Grubauer was in net there or not. The system was going to bring whatever goalie up and not vice versa. Next, they sought Andre Burakovsky, 5 years, $5.5 million per. 39 points, 16 points, and 37 points in 3 seasons before they were able to ship him out. Now, especially with some of the contracts we've seen today, $5.5 million doesn't seem all that bad. But you need to look at it in the context of 2022. We were just coming off of COVID, where the cap had stayed flat and or only raised $1 million. So $5.5 million back then is not the same as $5.5 million now. Adjusting for inflation, you're probably looking at about $7 million cap hit today. Burakovsky always was a useful player, but for the term and the money that they signed him to, they needed him to be something that he wasn't. That he was going to be a first-line piece who could put up 60, 70 points a season, and that just wasn't going to be him. But again, they had talked themselves into, we need to take a big swing, we need to contend. And it didn't work out. And then, in my opinion, the worst free agency signing that they had, Chandler Stevenson. 7 years, $6.25 million. And you know what? It's not Chandler Stevenson's fault. Anyone would have taken that contract if it was offered to them. Chandler Stevenson performed so well in Vegas because he was in a sheltered role, did not have to take on top 6 minutes, and could just play his role, play it well, and not have to be a primary option. But again, with the amount of term and money you committed to him, you essentially forced his hand that he had to be a top-line option, and that's just not his game. It never was, and it's never gonna be. And the big problem with the Stevenson contract is, again, because you have to play him in the top 6, you have to play him on the power play with the money you've committed to him, you have stunted the growth of your young prospects because that ice time that could have been going to them has to go to Chandler Stevenson. But we'll get into more of that in a bit. Some other ones, Brandon Montour, 7 years at $7.1 million. Brandon Montour's put up decent numbers in Seattle, but again, he's not I don't think Brandon Montour can be a number one defenseman on a championship team. Because in Florida, he was not the number one on that team. Again, solid offensive defenseman, but again, it's another case of Seattle thinking that they were this close to contending and that Brandon Montour was going to put him over the top, and he hasn't. Again, no shade at Brandon Montour, very useful player. Ideally, you want him on your second pair, but again, you paid him like a top guy. He's got to be a top guy. Ryan Lindgren, 4 years at $4.5 million. He put up 9 points this year. Now, I know you don't get Ryan Lindgren for his offense. Any offense you get from Ryan Lindgren is a bonus. However, it's worth pointing out that 9 points is the lowest he's ever gotten in his career. So, ugh. And then the Bobby McMahon extension, 6 years at $5.7 million. Now, I know Bobby McMahon had 29 goals this year, and I know a lot of people really like Bobby McMahon. But let me ask you this. What's more likely? That at 30 years old, he gets his first 30-goal season. So again, ask yourself, what's more likely? That this is the guy he's really been all along, and it just took till now to unlock it, and that's who he's going to be going forward? Or the guy at 30 years old had a career year, and this is highly, highly, highly unreplicable? My money is on the latter. But let's get into the biggest sin of the Seattle Kraken in my mind, prospect development. We'll start with Matty Beniers, the first pick in Seattle Kraken history. You picked him second overall, and he hit the ground running. Ended up winning the Calder Trophy as a rookie. Looked like a solid two-way forward that he could be a number one center, Selke Trophy nominee. Seattle had struck gold with their first pick in franchise history, and it just hasn't worked out since. You know it's bad when your rookie season is your peak. He's never recaptured his form since, and he just seems almost lost out there from times. And it's sad because he still has potential to be that solid, great two-way forward. Not a Patrice Bergeron, Nick Suzuki level per se, but close to it. He could definitely be in Selke Trophy contention, but again, Seattle just bungled up his development. And you have guys like on the defense, Ty Nelson, Caden Price, Lukas Dragicevic. I'm not saying these guys have the potential to be world beaters, but these guys are all, in my opinion, easily top 6D in the NHL, just rotting in the AHL because, again, you've shelled out money for overpriced free agency. Berkeley Catton, who in the WHL proved to be one of the most creative, best pace pushers, best offensive players in Major Junior, had over 115 points for the Spokane Chiefs. He was box office. He was a superstar. This year, you kept Berkeley Catton on the roster. You didn't send him down. You didn't do that. You kept him. But you had him sit in the press box for the majority of the season. And when Team Canada came for the World Juniors, you refused to let him go. So I thought to myself, okay, well, this means they're going to play him more. Okay, so if he's going to play in the NHL, I'm still mad about it, but I get it. If you're going to play him, you're not going to send him to the World Juniors. You didn't play him, though. You sat him in the press box instead of sending him to the World Juniors, where he would have gotten first-line minutes, would have gotten more experience, would have actually got to, play some damn hockey. But you knew who the biggest one was going to be. Let's talk about Shane Wright, and oh God, how much time do you have? Now, I've always been a Shane Wright defender and a Shane Wright apologist. Sure, was he a douche at the Combine and in his interviews and that dropped him to pick 4? Sure. But Shane Wright had all the potential in the world to be a superstar, who was the consensus number 1 pick in the 2022 draft, who just falls into your laps at 4. You get him at 4. Not having to trade up, not having to do anything. You got the guy who everyone said should have been the number 1 overall pick. And at first, they didn't rush him. At first, things were doing well. You send him back to the OHL for another year. He ended up winning gold with Team Canada at the World Juniors, and he got into 8 games and put up 4 goals. Things looked pretty well. But again, development was stalled. Next year, he splits it between the AHL and the NHL, starts to catch fire towards the end of the season, ends it on a high note. And then the next year ends up with about 45 points. So again, we are seeing progression. Things are looking up. And then this year just went off a goddamn cliff. For his entire time in the NHL, Seattle has only been giving him 11 minutes of ice time per night. 11 minutes. For a guy who got exceptional status, was a consensus #1 pick in his draft year, you have just been letting him rot on the third and fourth line, giving him 11 minutes per night. Now, I'm not going to sit up here and pretend that Shane Wright has absolutely bursted the door down and blown the doors off when he has been on the ice, because he hasn't. But again, how much of that is Seattle's system? I firmly believe if Shane Wright were to be traded, you would see an instant increase in production and ice time. I think he needs to get the hell out of Seattle before they waste the vast majority of his peak. But that leads us to where we are today. And it seems they still have not learned their lesson. At the deadline, they tried trading for Artemi Panarin. Had a huge contract offer lined up for him. He refused to go to Seattle. And then the big one, last week, Jason Robertson, they offered him 8 years at $15 million. And he refused to waive to go to Seattle. This just shows that the players are starting to realize that if you want to win, Seattle is not the place to go, because Seattle was, is, and looks to be for the future the NHL's no man's land. So that is it through our dive through history looking at the Seattle Kraken. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.